Happy Friday to you. We are 3 days from Election Day. We are kind of on the back 5 of 15 priorities that your council needs to get right in the next 4 years. That's why I'm going through them. And today we are at solving our homelessness crisis here in St. Stephen. If you've lived here for any amount of time, it is no secret to you. It's been so bad that a few years ago, council declared an emergency. There was such visible homelessness in our community, people sleeping on park benches, people trying to find warmth in nooks and crannies and back alleyways and starting fires to keep warm. That is when we had no out of the cold program whatsoever or shelter. We worked together, some community groups came together and created a out of the cold, which was only open at nights to get people off the street and out of the dark and the cold and into a place where they could literally survive the night. But then, of course, all those people, 50 to 70 people living rough in our municipality, that has not improved. Those people were back on the street every day, which is why there was a residential push to have an emergency shelter 24/7 where people could, come in and get services throughout the day, get off the street, not need to find permanent shelter in encampments and things like that, which is, of course, just a temporary solution, and get meals and try to get their lives together. This is an emergency situation, having an emergency shelter. It is properly called that. Now, here's where the Venn diagram overlap of all the priorities we've been talking about. It starts to feel repetitive a little bit, but it is important to isolate how focusing on our business community means making a safer environment for businesses to function. So when you talk about safety, then we're talking about public safety, and I unpacked for you how Duncan, BC really tackled their safety issue in a few videos ago when I talked about safety as a priority. But of course, you can't do the safety thing without tackling the housing issue, the housing continuum. And separate from that, but of course, all together is the homelessness crisis. And I kind of separate those things because we need housing to be built in St. Stephen as we build up housing across. We need that to happen across the housing continuum, right? And that means getting people out of emergency shelter into bridge housing, supportive housing, transitional housing, the provincial housing, and then into market housing. So that is all the spectrum is where we need to be focusing on. And housing, beefing up our housing stock is different than our homelessness crisis. Our homelessness crisis is a specific silo, you could say, a strategy that we need to focus on with a plan. Now, we don't need another kind of vague plan. And this is the way that communities that are unsuccessful in managing their homelessness crisis, they just keep saying, we need to make a better plan, we need to make a better plan. But here's the thing, inaction has a huge cost. And so not solving this homelessness crisis in St. Stephen is costing our community. Even if you're just approaching this from a fiscal perspective, having those folks who are experiencing homelessness create public disturbances, costs money because, of course, the police are responding to those calls, and then they can't respond to other calls that are happening all the time throughout our community. So that it brings a huge cost. When our communities are unsafe, you have less activity downtown. When people don't feel safe, they aren't safe. That's what I say, that you've really got to make people feel safe. and then you will see activity in the streets, and then you will see businesses thriving. And also, this is that piece of homelessness versus housing. When I talked to the president of Future St. Stephen, he's, their job, Future St. Stephen, is the economic development arm of the Municipal District of St. Stephen. It is their job to approach developers to bring housing to St. Stephen. And he said when they talk to housing developers, one of their first questions is, If we're going to build, if we're going to develop in St. Stephen, and then ultimately, make sure that we make good on that investment by being able to sell those units, whether it's rental, whether it's purchase, we need to know that people actually want to move to and live in St. Stephen or stay in St. Stephen. So their first question is, how are you handling the biggest challenge, the biggest visible challenge in St. Stephen, the homelessness crisis? And up to now, Future St. Stephen and anybody really has only been able to say it's not really handled. There's still an emergency shelter downtown. That has been our solution for 2 years, and it is not a good solution. So the solution is bridge housing. The shelter is not a solution. Now, again, if you've heard me talk about this before, maybe you're going to say, I've heard Mark talk about this. I've talked about it a few times in my 96 videos now, but I want to focus on it again as one of the 15 priorities, because if we want housing, we need to solve our homelessness crisis. If we want safety, we need to solve our homelessness crisis. If we want businesses to thrive, we need to solve our homelessness crisis. And I do want to say as a caveat, not everyone who is experiencing homelessness is a problematic and disorderly person. In fact, I've talked on my personal account about, just imagine if you found yourself in homelessness, no family, nowhere to go because housing you got priced out, your landlord raised the rent, you can't do anything about that. You're on the street now. The shelter, the lodge is the only place to go. Imagine how awful it would feel to know that certain people, and I mentioned this with the safety thing in Duncan focused on the same 10 to 15 individuals who are very problematic, very disorderly, and breaking laws, and focused on that with a community safety police force. And again, I don't want to imply that St. Stephen is going to start up its own municipal police force, but communities are responding with patrols and community safety services. And there are many examples of that, and that's something that I would want to see going. But I've already covered that in other videos. But imagine what it would be like to need the shelter, literally for a roof over your head, and there are individuals who are wreaking havoc around the shelter, but the residents of the municipality, us in St. Stephen, are so opposed to the activity going around in the shelter that now you have candidates running for mayor or councillor whose solution is to shut down the shelter. And if that's not through zoning, it will be through bylawing the lodge out of existence. What happens to those folks? And no one's been able to answer this question to me outside of one answer, bridge housing. So I'm going to, again, phrase it to you, pose the question to you. What happens to the people who are in the shelter when you shut down the shelter tomorrow because of those few individuals who are causing disturbances around the shelter? Everyone is back on the street, in the woods, in encampments, in the alleyways, starting fires. And I've talked to volunteer firefighters who said they would go out into the woods to help these people. They'd see smoke, they'd hear calls, they're doing emergency calls in the woods, going to find these folks in like Elm Street Park. And of course, those stopped for the most part when the lodge came. Now, how do you solve the lodge? How do you take all the pressure off of the lodge? You don't close it down because, again, we're going to go back to what we were. So what is bridge housing? Bridge housing is a program. It is not just another shelter where, it's just a second site, essentially. That's how it gets caricatured, and that is false information. I just want you to know. Bridge housing, and I've had the CAMH, the Canadian Association to CAEH, the Canadian Association to End Homelessness, their bridge housing manual. I've gone through that before in other videos. It is a participation program, and this is how Peterborough, Ontario, I've used this as an example of just one of the many examples of communities that said, we've got our emergency shelter, there's visible disorder, the first responder calls are up in this area, the downtown is not feeling safe, residents are feeling frustrated, all the things. This is happening all over the place. The way that these communities solve their problem is with bridge housing. Bridge housing is where a municipality finds a site, then gets the funding, then hires an operator, and then builds it and moves people in. Those are the 4 steps. That is what I'm working on when, day one, ground zero. We had a site, For some reason, this entire council, this outgoing council, voted against that municipal land that the province said they would be ready to fund the units and the operator. So we need a site. When the ministers were here, Minister Hickey of Housing, Minister Miles of Social Development, I talked to them, asked, what do we need? They said, we need a site and we're ready to fund to solve your homelessness problem. What that looks like is a number of mini homes, maybe 8x8 or trailers with specific units. It's a fenced compound. You check in, you check out. There's 24/7 staff. There's security. There are services there, health services, because I've talked about the importance of tackling this issue in terms of housing, health, and policing. You need all three working together. And so that is where we say, okay, we do need to bring together that coordination and then that cooperation between those three files, those three areas, and then we need to start communicating back and forth with data. And that's what Peterborough did. They found the land. It was municipal land. They found the operator, the Elizabeth Fry Society. They moved people out of the shelter into these units where they immediately 90% reduction in first responder calls. I just want you to, that's mind blowing. What we are seeing around the shelter is too many human beings stacked and packed on top of each other, trying to get in, trying to get out. The operator is enforcing rules. The catch-22 is when rules are enforced, which residents want to see. Residents want to see rules enforced in the lodge, but then you get somebody who has been issued a ban because of open drug use or violence inside the shelter, and then they're on the street screaming to get into the shelter. What is the operator supposed to do? Of course, they call the police, but that disturbance has happened, and it's not ideal for anyone. Again, the reason for this is too many human beings at the only game in town, so to speak, the lodge, the shelter, all the pressure on that. So when you move a lot of those folks to bridge housing where they sign up as a participant, they agree to rules, they agree to expectations, they agree to a caseworker. Everybody in bridge housing has a caseworker, so whether that's a social worker or somebody in the agency that is operating it. And there are regular checkups, of course, if somebody is using drugs in this kind of bridge housing. And again, you might right away, I've heard objections. Pause this. I've heard objections. Well, bridge housing should not be admitting people who are addicted to substance. And then again, I say, this is like the shelter. If you don't admit someone who's addicted into the shelter, where are they? They're on the street. If you don't admit somebody into bridge housing who is addicted to substance, where are they? They're in the shelter or they're on the street. The way that other communities have solved this is giving someone space, giving someone dignity, giving someone their own bed, their own door to close and lock. And you would not believe how incidents go down when people who are addicted to substance are not literally bunking together in a closed space and always with each other 24/7, okay? So again, think about bridge housing, not in the caricatures you've heard, but as a health program, a participation program. Social development is involved in funding this properly. You have an operator that is adhering to the highest standards of the Canadian Association to End Homelessness, for example. And then you have people moving out of that. They're able to go to detox. This is the next thing we need to solve is when somebody goes to detox, which is still months of waiting. So this is where you'll have people in bridge housing, but they're waiting for months to get into detox. That's one way that our province is really dropping the ball. But when they go through detox, they come back to St. Stephen because this is where they live. This is where they know everybody. It's what you would do if it's the only town you grew up in or knew anybody. You'd come back home, but then, of course, you don't have a home. You're back in the shelter. Everybody's using, and that's where a lot of people relapse. So I love to see and work on, as your mayor with your council, a place where people who have been through detox can land. Usually that's sort of a supportive group home setting and that kind of thing. But we've got to stop saying our hands in our pockets, we're shrugging our shoulders saying, well, there's no location. Again, the ministers said, find us a location and we will fund this. There's money set aside. But what we've got right now, and in terms of your options for mayor at least, is somebody who voted against the current site and said we need to make a plan. We have somebody who I've heard is bent on closing the shelter or bylawing the current shelter out of existence, which puts everybody else on the street. Or what I want to do is to end the need for the shelter, completely eliminate the need for the shelter, not as an opponent of the shelter or of the clients who are using it or of the staff who are there, but getting that next step, bridge housing, making sure it is serviced properly and supervised properly, and that residents there are submitting to the program as a participant where they are ultimately getting well. That is what we want to see happen. And then, of course, getting people into the detox who want to do that, and then getting them into that next step, a supportive housing space. That is what we need to work on. I want to remind you that we have a municipal plan. We do have a municipal plan here. And I've talked about, one of the 10 things is rural freedoms and farms. And I really like the 10 focuses of the municipal plan. And one of them is to address resident homelessness in a fair and compassionate manner. We also have the Southwest Service Commission that delivers services mandated through the Regional Service Delivery Act. I've got that act right here. And in section 3.1, it says, in addition to the mandate of the other subsections, any commission prescribed by regulation is mandated to develop a plan for integrating and coordinating services to address homelessness, poverty, and mental health, and may enter into an agreement with the Crown to do so. So we've got the Southwest Service Commission helping on this. We've got a municipal plan that is intent on this. And I just want to remind you that the province is recognizing that we have a crisis here. And the way to do that is with that bridge housing solution. And when we solve homelessness, we solve safety, and then we solve housing, and then we solve the business issue, right? All these things are working together, but we need to look at them each individually and say, what is the next step? Peterborough did that. It was contentious when it happened because it's not an easy decision. There are different opinions around it, but when we see communities actually push through that, pilot that, let's try it for a year and see what happens, as opposed to living in an emergency, that is the change we all need desperately in St. Stephen, and that's what I'm offering you as your candidate for mayor. All right. There are 3 more videos to go. We'll talk more about governance and things like that. BuildUpStStephen.ca. Let's build up our way out of this homelessness crisis and do right by everyone involved, the neighbors, the residents, the staff there, the operators. We can find the solution, and we're not reinventing the wheel. Take care of yourself today, friend, and your neighbor. I'll see you at the home show at the Garcelon Civic Center. I'm a Rotarian, so I'll be at the table there for a little while, and I look forward to meeting so many of you, and we'll be back again tomorrow. Cheers, friends.